And in naturalism, what is the whole view of nature? Like in naturalism, is nature your friend? Not even a little bit, okay? So nature is not our friend. In fact, nature is cold. Not literally cold because, you know, the guy was cold up in the Yukon, right? But nature doesn't care. He doesn't care. It doesn't care about us, okay? Now, remember that naturalism is a subcategory of realism. And I gave you these little phrases down here, which I think are kind of cool. Just to review, what does this whole romantics look up mean? What does that mean? They're optimistic, which means naturalists looking down would indicate what? They're pessimistic, okay? And then realists just kind of look at what is in front of them and they describe it, right? So it hinges on this idea that we as individuals have little to no control of our surroundings. And that's pretty bleak. You know, we don't like that idea. We don't like the idea of the control being taken away from us, right? Okay, Megan, come up and take your temp and grab the sheet off the back, okay? All right, so I don't know if we got to this slide yesterday or not, but you need to know that naturalism has been influenced by Darwin, and what you know of Darwin is probably the whole idea of natural selection, right? And in the idea of natural selection, who survives?
The dog.
Well, in the story, the dog, but in Darwin's theory of natural selection, the strongest survive, right? And in that environment that we see in our story, the dog is the one that's best suited to survive because he's got instinct. Y'all are making some very peculiar, what?
Here's this Justin.
Oh. Well, I told Braden not to, like, get up there and dance on it, but he just wasn't listening to me.
That's not my hair.
There you go. Get you something to clean it with. Okay. All right, so let's see. Humans are controlled by their environment. Again, we have very little control over what happens to us, okay? All right, so getting into the story, and because it's such a long story, I took some of the sections that I really liked and thought I would kind of read through them with you. All right, so we got 50 degrees below, except we know that the guy is actually traveling in 70 degree below weather, okay? But in his mind, when he gets started, he thinks it's only 50 below, which is still pretty dang cold, right? So Jack London writes, 50 degrees below zero meant 80 odd degrees of frost. Such fact impressed him as being cold and uncomfortable, and that was all. It did not lead him to meditate upon his frailty as a creature of temperature and upon man's frailty in general, able only to live within certain narrow limits of heat and cold. And it did not lead him to the conjectural field of immortality and man's place in the universe. This idea, man's place in the universe, is very much a naturalism idea because it takes the individual and reminds us that the individual in the grand scheme of things is pretty small. But the guy that is traveling with the dog in such cold weather, he doesn't get it. He doesn't get it. Okay? All right. At the end of this, London tells us that there should be anything more to it than that was a thought that just flat never entered his head. Okay? So we talked yesterday, the man, surely the cold kills the man, but what else about the man's personality really does him in?
He's stupid.
Yeah, he's arrogant, right? He doesn't listen to people who know better. And so if you're looking at and this was one of the questions on that Google form, if you're looking at an overall lesson, you have the idea that nature can crush the human spirit. We get that, okay? But also a more practical idea, and that is listen to people who have good advice and have experience in the matter. This guy absolutely does not. The dog on the other hand, okay? A big native husky, wolf dog, gray-coated, without any visible or temperamental difference from its brothers, the wild wolf. So this is a wild animal. He is, domesticated to a certain degree, but in this story, y'all, the dog represents nature. Okay, that's very important to understand. It knew that it was no time for traveling. Instincts told it a truer tale than the man's judgment had told him. Okay, so the dog is more suited to survive because he's got that natural instinct, right? Now, we have the impression in this story that nature is not just indifferent to the man, but there are lots of places in the story where it seems that nature is out to get the guy. In fact, there are a couple of places that talk about these areas that look, well, they don't look like traps. That would make them not a trap, right? They look like they're safe to pass through, but they're actually traps, and this is one of them. The man knew there were springs, hot springs that bubbled out from the hillsides, and he knew that even the coldest snaps never froze those springs. Well, what happens is if he's passing along and he can't see the springs underneath and the ice and the snow is very thin, his weight's going to cause him to fall. And he's going to get drenched, and when that happens, it's life or death, right? Thus the title of the story, To Build a Fire. So what is fire representative of in the story? It's life. Okay? And in that second fire that he builds, I think this is the right passage. Yeah. So he builds the second fire, and he is starting to pull his shoes off so he can dry them off. But before he could cut the strings, it happened. It was his fault or his mistake. He should not have built the fire under the spruce tree. And we talked about this yesterday, I think. What happens when he builds that second fire? All that snow that was built up on the limbs of that tree, when the fire gets strong enough to melt that, it literally snuffs out the fire, which is going to tell us what about this man's life.
He's gonna die.
Yeah, he's going to die. He is not going to make it, okay? So if the fire is life and it gets snuffed out, this guy's not going to make it, okay? And the cold, the snow, the ice, all of that is like sure death, right? So there are a couple of your symbols there. I know that was part of your own questions too. All right, so let's see the ending. Now, I'm not a big fan of this story. I think we've already talked about that. For instance, when he's all about maybe I can, get that dog and split his gut. Didn't we talk about that yesterday? I'm all over the guy at that point. It does not really, he lost me.
You wanted him to die.
Well, I don't know if want's such a strong word. But I didn't feel bad about him dying, right? And be honest, did you guys? How many of y'all finished the story? Some of y'all didn't finish the story. I can tell. Y'all have guilty look. I know Braden did. Some of y'all have.
Did.
What?
Did you say didn't or did?
Did.
Okay.
Because you were good. You were on top of things yesterday when we were talking. Or at least, I think you did.
Yes.
And you're bluffing really well if you actually didn't. Some of y'all can tell by the looks on your faces that you didn't finish the story. You look guilty. Okay? All right, so here's the ending in case you missed it. All right? The man he runs around trying to warm up. He realizes that is futile, pointless. And he knows that his friends are going to come looking for him. So he decides, I might as well accept it and die with some little bit of dignity. And so he sits down, okay? And if you've heard anything or read anything about, what it might feel like to die by freezing to death, because there are accounts of folks who came close and then survived, right? They all describe it as very peaceful, kind of like a numbing, and then you fall asleep. And that's what Jack London gives us here too. The man drowsed off into what seemed to him the most comfortable and satisfying sleep he'd ever known. He's dead, okay? The dog sat facing him and waiting. The brief day drew to a close in long, slow twilight. There were no signs of fire to be made, and besides, never in the dog's experience had it known a man to sit like that in the snow and not make fire. Now, the man remained silent. Look at the imagery in this, by the way. The dog whined loudly, and still later it crept close to the man and caught the scent of death. This made the animal bristle and back away. A little longer it delayed, howling under the stars. This is beautifully written now, okay? Howling under the stars that leapt and danced and shone brightly in the cold sky. So if we look at the imagery there, if you were going to write a little analysis of that, the fact that the night sky is cold reminds us that nature doesn't care about our feelings. It's pretty cold to us. And also, the stars are leaping and dancing. Typically, when you leap and dance, what's the emotion?
Happiness.
Yeah, so not only do they not care, but some of them seem to be quite happy that this man has fallen victim to nature, right? And his own stupidity, as we said. So here's the dog, nature, right? Then it turned and trotted up the trail in the direction of the camp it knew. Where were the other food providers and fire providers? So if the dog is nature, what does nature literally do in the end of the story? It's right there. Not a trick question. What's it say the dog does?
Leaves.
Yeah, turns its back on the man and trots away. So you have this great ending, even though, I mean, the story is really, really long and you have to have a lot of patience to get through it. But I do love the ending because A, I'm a fan of the dog. But B, I mean, if the dog is nature, you have this great scene where nature just turns its back on man. And that, y'all, that's naturalism. Okay? But it's not the only kind of naturalism. Naturalism, as you can tell from the name, has nature in it, is most often man pitted against nature. And we talked yesterday, too, about some of these television shows and series where, you've got folks that are trying to survive and make it out in nature. But honestly, there's a lot to be said about the difficulties and the dangers of any environment. So about the turn of the last century, not into the 2000s, but the turn of the century into the 20th century, right? You have all of these immigrants that are flooding in. Well, honestly, we still have a lot of immigrants coming in, don't we? But we have all these immigrants that are flooding into our cities, and a lot of the cities become really overcrowded. And you have these urban areas that crop up that are pretty brutal, okay? And so you have these journalists and photographers who start to look at life in what they called tenement housing, okay? So you have this whole other side of naturalism that is urban naturalism, okay? Same time frame, 1865 to about 1915, okay? But they called this idea the city as dangerous school of thought. Have y'all ever heard of a muckraker? Okay, so muckraker is an important term. And did it show up on your EOC? Wow. See, I should have had this last week. Oh well, at least you knew what it was. If the muck, and we know this from Their Eyes Were Watching God, okay? If the muck is like the grit, the dirt, the earth, the dirty, okay? If you're raking that, you are bringing it to the surface, right? So the journalists and photographers who were muckrakers, they brought all that ugly truth where? To the surface for everybody to see. And photography was so important back then. It was still a relatively new medium. And a picture is really hard to argue. So you would have people who wrote about these horrid living conditions, but then you would have the photography that would accompany it. And you just can't argue the truth behind the photography. And of course, this was way before people started tampering with photographs and things. Well, there was maybe a little of that, but nothing like we see today. Okay? All right, so muckrakers, they are the journalists who raked up the muck to reveal the brutal truth. They brought the dirt of poverty to the surface. Okay? All right, now a lot of this comes because we have these incredibly busy years with immigration, okay? Now, this is a old photograph of Ellis Island, which is off of the the coast of Manhattan. It is right there, very, very close to the Statue of Liberty. Y'all probably seen the pictures. Do any of y'all know if you have relatives who came through Ellis Island? Not sure. My family came from mostly Ireland, actually before the potato famine, but the early 1800s. They did not come through Ellis Island though, because this wasn't open yet. By the way, Ellis Island was on the East Coast. Do you know the name of the processing facility on the West Coast?
Is that Angel?
Angel Island. Good. Angel Island. Okay. So I'm into photography, and I got to go to Ellis Island. I don't know, it's probably been 10 years ago now. And some of these photographs I took at a display in Ellis Island, and others I found just on the internet and such. But I love old photography. So here's an old Italian, or an Italian family. They're not old, but an old picture of them leaving Ellis Island to go into New York. And y'all, what you may not know is that Ellis Island, I mean, they would give all kinds of tests to the immigrants that would come through. And if you were deemed like physically unhealthy or mentally unstable, you could be denied entry. And there were families that would have to kind of on the spot decide, are we going to all go back as a family, or are we going to split up and go in and leave, Uncle Ryan to go back home? And I say that because my son has a crazy Uncle Ryan. Everybody has a crazy uncle, right? Anyway. The go-betweens. That was the name given to the children of the immigrants who were navigating their home culture with the new culture and environment of America, right? And children were often the first to learn the language, to learn English, because those little kids, their brains are spongy and they get to they pick stuff up faster. Have you heard of a man named Jacob Riis? Okay, so Jacob Riis and another man named Louis Hines were photographers at the time, okay, and they did what was called social photography. Well, Jacob Riis is incredibly famous because he published a work that had photographs taken in the tenement buildings. And the name of the work was How the Other Half Lives. And it, documented in a way that no one could argue, right, in photographs, the poverty of this tenement housing and the immigrant's life. And, the more privileged in the country started to truly see the problems, and that's where we start to get reform, okay? So, I hope this lets me play. Here's a little video. Oh no, what? It wasn't private last time. Let's see if I can figure this out. It played last time with Jacob Riis. I think it's, video. It's also with photography. It has to do with flash photography. I thought that was so cool. Well, this is a bummer. Let's see if I can find the right one. Okay, well, we'll see what this one's about.
You're looking at a time-lapse video recorded by the Library of Congress showing the process of constructing the exhibition Jacob Riis, Revealing How the Other Half Lives.
Oh my gosh.
We visit the exhibit in the library's Thomas Jefferson building to learn about the life of the Danish-born journalist, social reformer, and photographer.
At the beginning of the exhibit, we've chosen 3 very famous photographs from the lexicon of Jacob Riis. And to the left is perhaps his most famous photograph called Bandit's Roost. And it was in the middle of an area called Mulberry Bend, which was a section of Mulberry Street near Baxter Street that became a particular cause célèbre for Riis in terms of urban reform. And he eventually would succeed in working with municipal authorities to demolish Mulberry Bend and replace it with a park, which is another story that we tell deeper into the exhibit with original items.
Again, the paradox about Rees is that he himself said that he was a photographer after a fashion. In other words, that he wasn't a real photographer. He used the camera for very few years, less than 10 years, and he only took about 300 pictures, about a third of which were like family snapshots and, you know, of other things that are not of historic importance. His most famous picture today is Bandit's Roost, which shows a couple of toughs, Italian toughs wearing bowler hats. In fact, that picture was copied by Martin Scorsese in a movie, The Gangs of New York. So it's a kind of iconic image. When he first had the idea to use photographs to illustrate the slums, and that was in 1887, he reached out to a friend who was a photographer, and he found two photographers who were interested in flash. Flash photography was the reason he had the idea to even use photographs at all. He was a writer, he was a journalist, he was writing in a daily newspaper about the conditions in the slum. He read in the newspaper in 1887 that there was this new invention of flash powder that could illuminate the darkness, and he said, aha. So he worked with these two other photographers who were serious amateurs who were interested in flash. They were interested in the technology. And among their photographs is Bandit's Roost, which was actually taken with a stereoscopic camera, which has two lenses. So there are actually two images of Bandit's Roost, but it's the right side, which has those two tufts in the bowlers. That's the famous image. It's, again, another irony.
Flash photography was important because the tenements were dark.
But the
and
flash
dim.
photographs, what
So
I
you
think
wouldn't
is
have
the most
even been able
important
to
of the
like
flash
see the
photographs was
images
one
they would have
called,
taken before the
5
invention
cents
of
a
flash
pop.
photography. So he was
And
able to
what
actually
it's
get inside
demonstrating
and take
are people
candid
that
pictures.
paid 5 cents or 7 cents a night to have temporary lodging inside a tenement house where they weren't living, but they would come just to sleep for the night. And those people on the floor paid 5 cents, and the people up on the shelf paid 7.
There was a law in New York that you had to provide a bed of some kind, an independent bed for someone, and the lowest price you could charge was 7 cents. So the title indicates to the viewer that this was illegal shelter. And Rees took the picture, that was taken by him, not by the other amateurs. He took the picture with a member of the sanitary police who were essentially raiding the place and saying, this, get up and out, this is illegal. So entering this room, which only had the slightest bit of light from a coal stove that was providing heat for the room, Rees entered with the police, set up his camera, essentially set off an explosion.
Scared him to
It
death.
sounded like a gun, a boom with smoke and fire. And what's captured in the picture is the faces. Some people are still sleeping and other people have been aroused and look sort of stricken for good reason by the circumstance. The picture, in his description of the scene in his book, he says there were 13 people in that room, tiny little room, including an infant, a screaming infant. So it's a horrific scene, and he used that picture to try to try to rouse authorities to enforcing the laws about these lodging houses. And he describes that in his book. So that is a fantastic example of one of Rees's flash photographs, creating a very powerful portrait of inhumane conditions. Pictures like that have been criticized for essentially victimizing his subjects, that he came in, that there was no consent, that he scared these people to death, and that they look it. And that is a criticism, a modern criticism today of these flash photographs. It was not his intention, but it is, from a contemporary point of view, a problem.
All right, that's pretty good. That was a good video. I'm glad that I'm glad I found that as quickly as I did. All right. So, anywho, oh, now it's gonna play. Seriously? Okay. Anyway, dang it. There we go. All right. So, Reese was one of the photographers. Another one was a guy named Lewis Hines. Okay, and he did the same. He would go into these, poor neighborhoods, and he would photograph the subjects, but his were more like portraits, okay? So this was a portrait of a little girl that he calls Little Mother, and it's not because she is the mother of that child. It's because, people had large families back then, and the older children often had to take care of the younger children, right? So there's one of the portraits. These are orphans at an orphanage. This is little orphan Annie, he called her, and I always thought that was interesting because a little longer, maybe after this, there is the famous cartoon, Little Orphan Annie, that comes out. And I didn't know if those were, tied together in some way or not. I should probably look that up. Now, folks, kids worked. This what he called homework, because this little guy is taking home all this stuff that he is supposed to work on at home. You think your homework stuff, right? So he publishes, this is Jacob Reese, not Lewis Hines, but he publishes how the other half lives. And of course he writes, but also includes his photographs in that. All right, here is Dens of Death, Jacob Reese. Look at how these houses are, just about to crumble, it looks like. $1 a month's rent would get you, a place to live here. New York City tenement. Here's a little girl taking a bath. Keep that image in mind. We're going to get back to that later. She looks like she's having a great time, but it does not look clean to me. A family that rolls cigars in their home. The whole family's involved. This one's a little bit, I don't know, these guys look maybe like they have a little bit more money, but there's still a bunch of people in there. These little boys falling asleep just on the steps outside. And if you want a little fresh air, what do? Well, you take your kids up to the top, the roofs where you're doing laundry, and let your little kids run around, though I would imagine that's pretty dangerous too. So the point is, y'all, the urban environment could be every bit as dangerous as a natural environment, okay? Let's see if there's anything else. Sweatshops. Y'all probably heard of the Triangle Fire. Have y'all heard of the Triangle Waste Company fire, where the young women that were making these blouses that were incredibly popular in the day, they had been locked in to keep them from taking bathroom breaks and such, and they were actually locked in on one of the floors of the building. I think it was like 11 stories. I'm not sure which story that they were housed on, but because they had been locked in, when the fire broke out, they, either died in the fire, or many of them chose to jump to their death rather than burn. And these kind of things would bring reform. So after the Triangle Waste Company fire, you start to have laws protecting the workers. You have, fire escapes and things that get created. Child labor. I mean, it's just pretty brutal, right? Here is, and it wasn't just in the cities. Here is a little girl working a machine in Tennessee. And y'all, they liked children working machines because their hands are little, and they could get into the little parts and actually access things that adults with their big hands couldn't. Georgia Cotton Mill. Here's a little boy who lost his arm in a saw factory, and there was no workers' comp. I mean, there was no recourse. If you had this accident happen, you were just going to be maimed for the rest of your life, right? Newsies, these little guys look pretty tough. They're the ones. Who are the newsies? What would they do you think? This is in the city. Yeah, they would pass out papers. They would sell newspapers, right? little boy at night school falling asleep. This looks familiar. Ooh, I feel like I've seen a few of you guys that have fallen asleep in class. And out in the fields in the South as well. So, you know, I mean, it just was a pretty rough time to be poor in America, okay? Ellis Island closed in the late 1950s. Y'all, it sat empty for like 40 years, and in the 1980s, they renovated it, and it was open to the public in 1990. So if you ever get a chance to go to New York and you've got an afternoon, go see Ellis Island. It is like amazing, okay? All right, so we have just enough time for y'all to take a highlighter and read through the bio on Stephen Crane and an excerpt from a book called, oh, I forgot to talk about the jungle, but y'all know about the jungle, right? The meatpacking industry. Pretty gruesome stuff. That was Upton Sinclair. He was a muckraker as well. But Maggie, a Girl of the Streets is a novel by Stephen Crane, who had also written The Red Badge of Courage. Okay, very famous book. But Maggie, a Girl of the Streets, tells of a girl who is like crushed by her environment, okay? I have taken chapter 2 as an excerpt so you can kind of get a sense of this urban naturalism. What I want you to do is read all of this right now, and you highlight the imagery. When you get to the story, you highlight the imagery, okay? Do that now.